A locked room, a cold bowl, a missing name. You stand barefoot on stone as footsteps swell, key metal kissing metal, damp wool scratches your wrists, the room keeps its breath. Vienna, 1793. The Hofburg wakes to protocol and incense while your tower stays dim. The crown had one rule: imperfection vanishes. You have learned it without words. No lessons, no Latin, no birthday candles, only the careful avoidance of eyes. You are 7, though no one tells you numbers. You count by dust motes. Outside, the court polishes lineage. Inside, breakfast arrives already tired. The attendant sets down porridge, looks past you like a window that isn't there, and leaves. The lock answers with a small, satisfied click. Last year, Leopold II died. His son rules on, and Europe burns across the border in France. In these halls, perfection is policy, and policy is a quiet throat pressed under velvet. You hum to keep time with the corridors, invent games the walls can win. Stay to the end to see the portrait they couldn't burn. If memory matters, tap like and subscribe. Now keep watching. The unwritten law moves faster than decrees. In palaces that preach divine order, succession is a narrow bridge, and any misstep threatens the river below. Before physicians will name anything in 1866, courtiers already have a vocabulary: delicate, weakly, not suited to public life. The phrases do what laws cannot. Close doors without leaving fingerprints. Ink dries. A courtier forgets a footstep. Across Europe, the 1790s shake thrones. The French Revolution turns crowns into liabilities. And in response, other dynasties harden. If legitimacy can fall in a square, then purity must be defended in a nursery. Perfection requires choreography. Genealogists prune family trees the way gardeners prune roses. Snip, tuck, tie. Tutors draft lesson plans that will never be taught, then file progress reports with careful lies. Confessors remind parents that suffering sanctifies, as if shame were a sacrament. Portrait painters learn to negotiate absence. A crib rendered as a blur of light, a tiny sleeve half hidden in brocade, a canvas completed without a face. When the frame is delivered, the back is waxed over the artist's name. There is a ritual to erasure: order, cover, erase. A scribe receives a ledger with a page already damp from steam. He lifts a knife, not to cut, but to tease fibers apart, replacing a name with paper pulp and paste. Later, the book dries under a press, and the seam becomes history's silence. A seamstress measures a ceremonial jacket for a child who will never wear it, pins in place, and then is told to unmake the garment, salvaging buttons, rescuing thread, leaving no evidence in the wardrobe. A footman learns the right number of steps to place a tray and retreat before the lock clicks. Mainstream doctrine, primogeniture. Salic law was meant to simplify inheritance, but in practice it multiplies fear. A single child carries treaties, dowries, alliances. A single difference jeopardizes all three. And because the crowds outside have learned to shout down kings, the courtiers inside learn to whisper children away. The rule repeats across borders like a catechism: what does not fit must not be seen. He, any she, becomes a secret kept by paid devotion and professional distance. Somewhere, a nurse keeps a ribbon, a pressed leaf, a drawing of a sun with too many rays. Somewhere else, a family seal melts into new wax. The unwritten law stands unchallenged until in England, a boy at Sandringham teaches a court the word it prefers: mercy, and what it really means. In England, the rule learned a gentler accent. John, youngest son of George V and Queen Mary, entered the world at Sandringham in sailor suits and official photographs, a proper prince in miniature. Then seizures arrived, and with them the vocabulary of withdrawal: delicate, best kept quiet, not suited to public life. By the end of his 4th year, the lenses turned away. Servants learned to speak around him as if words themselves might trigger storms. He was moved out of view, first to quieter rooms, then, in time, to Wood Farm on the estate, where life could be managed like a garden path. There, Charlotte Lala Bill became a country of one for him. She learned the cycles of his mornings, the particular stiffness in his right hand before an episode, the quick delight he took in simple rituals, sorting conkers by size, watching the gardener roll lawns, laughing at games only he understood. When visitors came, they came carefully. Queen Alexandra wrote in a private hand about poor little Johnny, and then the carriage wheels rolled away. His brothers and sister were discouraged from visiting. The state had heirs to polish and schedules to keep. Wood Farm kept its own calendar, weather, birds, the pantry bell, the hour when Lala would unwrap paper and pencils. He drew the world as he perceived it. Round suns with too many rays, a crown reduced to triangles, a house with 4 windows for 4 seasons. Lala saved everything. The smudged pages, the found feathers used as brushes. The string, he insisted, was a river. In the big house, portraits measured perfection by symmetry. In the small house, a crooked circle could be a life entire. War ran in the background like distant thunder. The family wrote letters of stoicism. The nation bled and counted. On a January night in 1919, a seizure took Prince John quickly. The court chose a word that sounded like kindness and functioned as policy: release. It soothed the living and filed the dead. Lala folded the drawings into a box and was pensioned off, carrying a museum the country had no room to hang. The lesson drifted back through the corridors. A euphemism can tidy what a dynasty cannot bear to name. Across the channel long before, another nursery had learned the same technique in fewer days. Across the channel, the lesson condensed to 43 days. At Fontainebleau in 1640, the Bourbons staged perfection with the same care they staged ballet de cour. Louis XIII was still alive, Richelieu still rearranging Europe, and Anne of Austria, mother queen and future regent, for the boy who would become the Sun King, stood inside a nursery where light had to be choreographed. The official register offered a bland phrase: a weak infant who failed to thrive. The private letters, the ones folded into medicine chests and stitched behind bindings, used other words entirely. Soft nasal bridge, a tongue that would not stay, small hands with a single crease. The courtiers did not need the name that would be written in 1866. They already knew the ritual. There was a wet nurse, of course, and with her the liturgy of blame. She swore she fed the child. She swore again when the priest came. When the physicians questioned her, they called the questions compassion. When the steward questioned her, he called them accounting. Outside the nursery, the king hunted. Inside, someone counted heartbeats that stumbled. On the 40th day, the royal chapel was full of candles. On the 43rd, only tapers in a side oratory burned. The cradle was moved, and then it wasn't there at all. Mainstream history remembers what came next. 1643, the death of Louis XIII, Mazarin and a regency. A boy named Louis Dieudonné maturing into Le Roi Soleil, Versailles. Mirrors, a court designed to keep every eye occupied. But back at Fontainebleau, a painter left without finishing a commission. The anecdote survives in workshop gossip. He could not make innocence sit correctly on the child's face without breaking the rules of flattery. And so the canvas acquired a habit of absence, a blur where lace should be, a glow where a mouth would form. Payment was withheld. The frame was used for another portrait. Anne of Austria ordered special prayers at 2 shrines. Someone noted the hours. Someone else noted the stars. Every explanation worked better than the simple one, that nature permits variation even in palaces. The cradle went to a storeroom, and the storeroom got a new lock. The ledger settled on its safe verb and closed. In Versailles, decades later, mirrors would tell the world that royalty was geometry perfected. The seam left by those 43 days stayed behind glass, invisible unless the light came from the wrong angle. And when empires shifted east, another nursery perfected the art of keeping a child present on payroll and absent on paper. East meant Petersburg and the habit of double books. In the Alexander Palace, the east wing kept its own weather, corridors cool even in June. Windows filmed with frost lace by November. The imperial genealogy showed no such climate. It showed heirs stacked like metals and marriages arranged like rail junctions. Yet in the clerk's room, a steady line item persisted: wages for 2 nurses, a laundress, and a night porter assigned to the nursery East Wing, renewed month after month for 16 years, after an obituary had briefly noted an infant daughter who failed to live. She played with dolls. The letters between ladies-in-waiting said, and never quite learned speech. At 14, she was still safest with ribbons and wooden blocks, happiest when snow gathered on the sill like sugar. A maid swore the girl could mimic the chapel bells, striking the hours with a silver teaspoon against her toy chest and laughing when she matched them. On the great lawn, parades rehearsed. In the small room, a private monarchy ruled. 4 dolls seated by rank, a tin soldier promoted to kitchen guard, a bear appointed master of music because he knew when to hum. Mainstream history in Russia marched loudly. 1905 cracked the empire and taught it how to retreat. 1914 sent it to war. 1917 tore it down. While the Duma argued and soldiers chose sides, the East Wing retained its rituals. Linen tallied, coal delivered, the porter's late watch recorded with initials. During the February days, women with bread cards filled the squares. During October, the palace learned new keys. One evening, the night porter noted, "No disturbances, child sleeping." It was his last entry. What happened in the hours that followed, no ledger will say. A servant might have folded the girl into a shawl and carried her down the back stairs when the shouting began. A guard could have opened a door and then remembered it was kinder to close it. Or perhaps a nurse led her into a cupboard game, said, "Hush," and waited for the storm to pick another room to swallow. When the new authorities inventoried the palace, they counted candelabra and carpets, clocks and china. The East Wing nursery yielded toys, a spoon, a winter smock, and no name. The account column finally went blank. The genealogy stayed smooth. And far to the southwest, a different dynasty perfected the art of explaining misfortune as magic. Southwest meant Madrid, where genealogy was a geometry problem solved with cousins. The Spanish Habsburg tree bent back on itself until branches touched, and court painters learned to flatter a jaw that kept advancing. Mainstream history is comfortable here. Charles II, El Hechizado, the bewitched, who outlived childhood only to inherit a crown and a rumor mill. Ministers blamed enemies, priests blamed demons, pamphleteers blamed bad stars. When wheat failed, it was sorcery. When an heir failed, it was sorcery twice. Magic was a policy because it kept questions away from the nursery. Outside, dust climbed a sunbeam and settled on a tiny cradle. Behind the rhetoric, scribes did their quiet work. Ledgers in the Alcazar show christening oil purchased, then black cloth 3 weeks later. A dotted line where a name should go, a flourish where a page should end. Court Latin found new uses, not theology but taxonomy without confession. Facies plana, lingua protracta, sulcus palmaris unicus. The words closed the door while pretending to measure it. One physician, Diego Mateo Zapata, wrote outside the script. In 1693, he examined a princess whose name the registrar turned into a thicket of ink. He noted a small stature and a swallow that labored, a mind that learned in circles rather than lines. Then he wrote what the court could not abide. That difference might be Providence's variety, not punishment. He hid his notes in the false bottom of a medical compendium, as if even paper needed a safe room. Years later, the Inquisition's heat found him. The way state heat eventually finds anyone who writes in the wrong direction. Pages burned, debts multiplied, and the palace moved on without revising a single catechism. Meanwhile, the bewitched king's body, public property in life, became public evidence in death, and Europe marched toward the War of the Spanish Succession. Treaties debated who should wear the crown. Nobody debated what had been done to protect the myth behind it. In a side chapel, a seamstress reworked baptismal satin into corporals for the altar. Cloth remembers even when books forget. An anecdote passes from midwives' daughters. A child in the royal household who could not master curtsies but clapped perfectly on the second beat of a villancico. She loved bells and animals and the way sunlight turned dust to gold. She was moved to a quiet house outside the city where the gardener let her water the same rose 3 times. The rose survived. The entry for her clothes ceased. The household account resumed as if a page hadn't been lifted. Spain called it bewitchment and slept better. East of the Levant, a different palace dispensed with metaphors and built a cage. Ottoman pragmatism made its own nursery law. When Ahmed Verver died in 1617, the empire attempted something new. Instead of killing the spare sons, it opened Topkapı's cafes, the gilded cage, and chose the next sultan by seniority. The reform spared blood and spent years. Princes survived, but they survived indoors. Guards learned to inventory breathing the way accountants inventory coin. Concubines aged into wardens. Keys grew heavier from being used too little. The mainstream record is crisp. Corridors, eunuchs, petitions folded like birds. The door to each prince's suite marked by silence. The anecdote slips in later from a guard who wrote his memoirs after coffeehouses made history conversational. He described a room the registers listed as unoccupied because the prince assigned to it had died young. Unoccupied rooms do not consume olives and lamp oil for 23 years. Yet requisitions went in, regular as prayer. Inside, the man-child he found had the serenity of someone who no longer keeps other people's time. He hummed songs learned long ago from a wet nurse whose name the palace never wrote. On the floor, thousands of shards of colored glass, bottle fragments, lamp chips, broken charms, had been arranged into galaxies, palaces, rivers that flowed nowhere. Every day he added a piece. Every night he checked the borders with a tenderness that made the guard step back. He laughed when a sun aligned. He cried when a circle collapsed. He did not speak, because no one had required words of him in decades. The cafes had solved a problem and grown another. A dynasty could not show this to the world and remain a dynasty. Succession chaos after Ahmed's death meant every door was opened once. Every occupant counted. When they opened his, someone must have written a number and nothing else. The memoir lets the reader choose a kindness. Perhaps a trusted eunuch moved him to a courtyard garden. Perhaps a physician arranged a quieter room. Perhaps the door closed again because routine can pass for mercy when empires are busy. When the ledgers were finally regularized, the food allotment stopped, the oil order paused. The janitor's sweep note omitted a single line. Topkapı resumed its measured breath. Petitions in, judgments out, secrets nested like inlaid wood. Far to the northwest, palaces preferred softer cages, quiet wings and convents, where canaries and nuns taught a different repertoire of care and concealment. Bavaria preferred its cages feathered. At Nymphenburg, the quiet wing held its own weather. Cool corridors, blinds half drawn, canary song braided with shoe squeak on waxed floors. Official biographies reduced Princess Alexandra to a brief note, died at 3. Yet household ledgers kept paying 2 attendants and a bird dealer well into 1851, as if grief required seed by the sack. A governess's diary, donated decades later, described lessons that moved at the speed of birdsong. Spoon to mouth on the 3rd trill, buttons closed when the canary fell silent, letters traced as little tracks in dust. Alexandra liked yellow best. Some days she wore 2 ribbons, because one did not feel enough like sunlight. Mainstream history in Munich roared in 1848. Crowds, pamphlets, the abdication of Ludwig der Erster. The city beat a faster time, but the quiet wing kept its metronome. When the square shouted liberty, the nursery practiced tying laces. A seamstress came to alter a dress and stayed to teach a game with thread. The girl clapped when a knot held. The funeral, when it finally came, was private and punctual. No balcony waves, no cannon. The ledger bought flowers. The stonecutter received instructions. The registry printed a line that looked like an afterthought. Somewhere in the palace, an empty cage continued to be cleaned. Far southwest, Lisbon wrapped erasure in devotion. João Vitor could gild churches with Brazil's gold. He could also move a child to a convent where prayer schedules made excellent screens. An infant Infanta Maria was painted in haste, and then unpainted. Artists dismissed, sketches burned. A confession later murmured about a face that refused to flatter. At the convent of Santos o Novo, the sisters wrote the curriculum of kindness. Fold altar cloths, feed the cats, sing along without words. When fever came in 1745, they asked to keep her. The grave they cut was small and unadorned. The marker read only God's child. No dates, no lineage, no arms, just a mercy the court could sign because it left everything else unspoken. 2 rooms, 2 cities, the same arithmetic. Order, cover, erase. Softened by birds, softened by prayer. In one place, a diary survived. In another, a single line of stone did the remembering. The larger world kept its spectacles, abdications, Baroque facades, processions. The smaller world kept time with canaries and bell towers, teaching patience to hands that learned in circles rather than lines. Northward, palaces invented gentler lies, travel for health, caretakers called tutors, a boy who laughed at ants. And, far from Vienna, a monastery that would name a nameless child Felix, Denmark chose fiction with good handwriting. A prince named Gustav, delicate, they said, required air that changed often. The court announced health tours, then scheduled them like tides, Jägerspriss in spring, a seaside villa by late summer, a forest lodge when leaves turned, somewhere Italian when the Copenhagen fog refused to lift. Tutors were hired who taught more kettle and coat hook than Latin, how to stir without scalding, how to count buttons, how to read sky for rain. Their reports returned stamped and tidy. Excellent progress. Spirits improved. The kind of sentences that travel well. Mainstream history around them thundered. 1807. British shells over Copenhagen. 1814. The union with Norway broken. 1849. A constitution. The carriages still rolled. The prince waved from windows draped to look like convalescents. At night, the housemaids whispered he could sense weather 2 days ahead and always knew when someone lied. He watched faces the way sailors watch horizons. Across the water, Sweden wrote a newer genealogy and reused older rooms. The Bernadotte dynasty kept Tullgarn polished. The groundskeeper's boy, writing years later, remembered a strange friend who appeared only when the royal family did not. He could not speak, or chose not to, but he laughed at ants for hours. Kneeling to follow their roads, he feared no dog and every thunderclap. He clapped at the second beat of a waltz he'd never been taught. On days the flag flew, the friend vanished like dew. The boy learned the rhythm. 4 windows, 4 seasons, and a ghost who understood summer best. Mainstream history kept its ledger. Railways, reforms, the old order mended to fit new cloth, while a pantry door kept a stick figure drawing taped inside, 2 boys and a line of ants as long as a river. Back in Austria, the fiction was simpler, no name at all. A midwife's diary told how a Habsburg infant declared stillborn was later recognized at a monastery outside Vienna. The brothers called him Felix because happiness seemed to run ahead of him like a bell. He carried kindling, stacked bread, clapped for the organist with exquisite mistiming. He learned the hours by the way light crossed the refectory wall. When scarlet fever came, 1880, the abbot wrote, the entire house kept vigil in whispers. They buried him behind the apse. A small cross painted the color of wheat. No coat of arms. The wind remembered him better than heraldry. 3 countries, 3 disguises, travel, absence, and holiness. The ledgers stayed orderly. The rooms did the feeling. Belgium learned to wall a voice, literally. In the rain that turned the Congo into a ledger of rubber and ghosts, palace masons in Brussels were told to reconfigure a corridor. Servants later remembered a small door that vanished beneath new plaster. A maid named Marie Delacroix whispered about a girl in the sealed space who sang nonsense songs and pushed berry-red handprints through a thumb-wide gap. Marie slipped crusts and toys inside. In return came drawings, sun faces with enormous smiles, a crown that looked like a fence. Mainstream history writes King Leopold II in black ink for colonial crimes. The nursery records write almost nothing at all. Years passed. The singing stopped. The wall kept its perfect line. Italy rehearsed a more presentable denial. The House of Savoy could not wholly hide Princess Giovanna, so it trained appearances the way opera houses train curtain calls. Arrive, wave, withdraw. Photographers kept distance. Handlers counted seconds. The public statement called her delicate. Behind closed doors, tutors leaned into repetition, building a life from music and animal gentleness. The dynasty stayed intact because a smile could be choreographed. Then the century hardened. In 1939-41, Germany's Action T4 industrialized what palaces had practiced quietly, erasure as policy. Some royal families suddenly understood the danger of their own euphemisms. Others doubled down on secrecy. A Prussian princess, kept in a private institution where she learned to read simple texts and miss-time piano, was quietly moved to Switzerland, an assumed name replacing a title until 1980. The lesson of the age was cruel in its clarity. Privacy could be a refuge and also a prison. After the fire, thin cracks appeared. In 1957, Luxembourg acknowledged a son with Down syndrome and said plainly that he lived in specialized care. In 1973, modern Spain allowed a nephew to be seen in photographs, not as a symbol, simply as family. Public relations teams learned new phrases: privacy, dignity, best interests, and retired others. The old law was not repealed, but it was at least named. Before we leave this ledger of silences, open one box. Lala Bill's bundle of drawings, the only portrait they couldn't burn. Back in Vienna, always back in Vienna, the tower light returns to its narrow angle. The child who counted dust motes now shares a silent ledger with rooms in Brussels, Turin, Berlin, and Zurich. The rule that once moved faster than decrees still exists, but its handwriting shakes. Somewhere, a nurse keeps a ribbon. Somewhere else, a wall still holds a song. The city outside the palaces settles into its ordinary twilight. Windows warm, bells loosen their last notes, and the long corridors lose their appetite for footsteps. In each place, Vienna, Brussels, Lisbon, Munich, Istanbul, a smaller weather persists. A climate made of objects that remember better than books. A spoon that tapped chapel hours. A canary's feather pressed in a diary. A thread game that ended in a reliable knot. A shard of blue glass turned to a private river and watched until the light slipped away. The rooms that held these things are quiet now, yet the quiet has changed. It carries less command and more listening. He was 7 and counted by dust. She was 14 and counted by ribbons. Another laughed at ants, another at thunder, another at nothing in particular, except the sheer fact of being alive. The courtiers called these differences threats and learned an elegance for hiding them. And yet, even within that elegance, small mercies challenged the script. A nurse who kept drawings, a monk who chose a name that meant joy, a maid who risked bread and a toy through the seam of a wall. The record declares those acts insufficient. Human memory declares them the part that mattered. History keeps the large instruments, the wars and abdications, the treaties and coronations, but it also leaves a pocket for quieter things, for the way a face opens to music, for the way sunlight turns dust to confetti, for the timbre of a humming voice that no audience will ever hear. If the old law insisted imperfection vanish, the present can answer with a different liturgy. That variation is not a verdict, that love is not a threat to order, that remembering is a form of repair. So let the final image stay simple. A narrow window, a careful bowl of something warm, a hand that does not hurry as it sets the tray down, and the smallest of nods, as if to say that this life belongs here. The door closes softly. The song continues on the other side.